In 1297, Scotland was under the control of the English King Edward I, but of course the Scots resented English control and an uprising began, led by the Scottish leader William Wallace. Now, Edward was on campaign in France at the time, and the Earl of Surrey raised an army for him of about 6,000, and there was a battle at Stirling Bridge in Scotland, which Wallace and the Scots won. Now, by February 1298, the Earl of Surrey, for Edward, was trying to get forces together to go and sort out this problem, because you have a full-scale revolt now happening in Scotland, and it's about time Edward went up there and sorted all this out. So as time went on, Edward ordered a full campaign against Wallace's army. He was going to arrive late, but eventually, by the time you get into the spring of 1298, which is when campaigns could go ahead because of the weather, of course, in those days, Edward was ready to go. And Edward's route north hugged the east coast of northern England and southern Scotland so that he could be supplied with food by sea. Along the way, he paused to capture Scottish castles, which again was typical of warfare in this time, so a bit of continuity, because castles were used as secure bases. Now, Edward also did have a baggage train with him, which was full of supplies, which is also a feature of warfare back in this period. He almost ran out of supplies in the end, but fortunately supplies did arrive by sea. But his campaign almost collapsed due to a shortage of food before it even got started, so in a way, Edward was quite fortunate. By the time they got to the summer of 1298, both armies were manoeuvring for position to have their competition somewhere near Falkirk in Scotland. So here we have William Wallace. On the left is a portrait of him from the time. On the right is the modern version of him from the 1995 Oscar-winning film Braveheart, which is worth a watch. It's very inaccurate historically, but it's a fantastic film, full of action, and gives you a sense of some of the ways in which warfare was enacted at that time. And Wallace is obviously a big inspirational leader in Scotland, and he's in command of the Scottish forces, and we will consider his role in all this a little bit later. Here we have Edward I of England, a portrait on the left, and once again his depiction in the film Braveheart on the right. And once again, sometimes we need to consider the role of individuals in GCSE warfare, so once we finish discussing the battle and what happened, we'll come back just to assess the role of these individuals during this contest. So here's a look at the battlefield, and you can see that Wallace and the Scots have chosen the location of this battle for good reason too. They're in the blue at the top of this diagram, and you can see that their rear is protected by Callender Wood. Ahead of them is marshland too, slightly downhill from them, which obviously would be useful in countering the English cavalry, slow them down as they charge through it. You can also see that they've arranged as well for packs of pikemen, or schiltrons as they're called at the time, in the four circles, with the Scottish cavalry behind them and their archers slightly in front of them. Good choice by Wallace. Location on the battlefield was incredibly important back then. It would give an advantage to one of the sides, of course. One of the criticisms we could make of Wallace here is obviously that his flanks are not particularly well protected, and the English could get at them from the sides once they've crossed the march. In terms of participants and numbers at this battle, the English overwhelmingly had the advantage. They had somewhere in the region of 15,000 men, whereas the Scots had about 10,000. As well as that also, you can see a graph on page 10 of your textbook of who fought at Falkirk. But the other advantages are the English army had probably 4 times the cavalry of the Scots, 2,250 versus 500 Scottish cavalry. And of course, as we're about to see, longbowmen too. The English had 5,500 longbowmen, whereas the Scots only had 1,500 as well. So numbers in terms of spearmen were about level. However, in terms of cavalry, in terms of longbowmen, in terms of overall strength of numbers, the English have the advantage here. Now there are 2 real stages to the Battle of Falkirk. If we deal with stage 1 first, as depicted on the diagram in front of you, we've said that the Scottish forces had taken up position at the top of a ridge with a marsh in front of them and with the wood at the background, but their flanks are open to attack. And Wallace had ordered his spearmen to form 4 rounded schiltrons, which are, we've talked about before in class. They're sort of like circular groups of spearmen to protect against cavalry. The battle started when Edward I decided to order some of his mounted knights, his cavalry, to charge up the hill to attack the Scottish cavalry. Now the English cavalry charge succeeded. The Scottish cavalry, who were outnumbered anyway, fled from the battlefield. Some would argue that that happened too easily, and perhaps the loyalty of some of the Scottish lords to William Wallace was very questionable. So once the Scottish cavalry had fled from the battlefield, Edward's next decision was to order his cavalry to attack the Scottish longbowmen, who were situated in front of the schiltrons, as you can see on the diagram above. The English cavalry charge against the Scottish archers also succeeded. The Scottish archers, who were pretty vulnerable, were cut down with swords, fled from the battlefield again, or some of them took shelter inside the schiltrons. And with the majority of Scottish archers removed, Edward decided that the English cavalry should now charge against the 4 enormous schiltrons. There were about 2,000 men in each schiltron, so this was going to be a tough challenge. So the English cavalry charged repeatedly against the schiltrons, but could not break them. And therefore the battle reached a bit of a stalemate at that point. Which brings us to stage 2 and the turning point of the battle here. The schiltrons cannot be broken, they're very effective against cavalry. And as a result of which, Edward decided to order the English longbowmen, about 5,000 men, forward to fire arrows at the schiltrons. And they fired thousands of arrows into the schiltrons. Scottish spearmen in the schiltrons didn't wear armour or helmets and were vulnerable to the arrows that were fired up in the air in great number and came down a bit like rainfall on them. Spearmen started to fall. Gaps began to appear in the walls of the circular schiltrons. Their structure started to dissolve and collapse. And at that point, Edward decided that he could move his cavalry and his infantry into these schiltrons, force their way into these gaps, and fight the Scottish spearmen at close quarters. The English cavalry therefore broke through the gaps that had appeared and hacked the spearmen down with swords. And once the schiltron formations were broken, really, that was the end of it. Many Scottish spearmen fled from the battlefield, some seeking shelter in Callander Wood, but thousands were cut down as they fled. And, of course, this turned into an English victory quite quickly. Scottish losses were huge, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 dead, of course we'll never know. The English, a lot less than that. And the battle, all in all, had taken no more than a few hours, which was, again, typical of warfare at this time, that battles tended to be done on the day, in an afternoon, that sort of thing, and rarely went on for day after day after day. Some of the conclusions we could draw from it. The English actions at Falkirk showed that the cavalry charge could be important, but of course schiltrons were very effective to defend against cavalry. And what you're starting to see now is that the longbow is going to become the decisive weapon in medieval warfare, as shown by its use at Falkirk. So if we just consider Wallace and his role, the good is that he was an inspirational leader, very passionate, very determined. His use of the schiltrons nearly worked. His choice of position was good, with the marsh and the woods and the slope. But there are criticisms. He failed to protect his flanks, and as well as that also, you've got to question his command of the forces, because there is that idea that some of his lords did flee from the battlefield a little bit quickly during the battle. So pros and cons for Wallace at Falkirk. Ultimately, he was defeated, but survived to fight another day. In terms of Edward, well, this campaign really struggled to get off the ground. His problems with supplying his troops by sea nearly ended the whole campaign as men suffered from hunger. So his advanced planning was admirable, but it only just worked, really. He had superior forces. There is the criticism that his cavalry were lacking control when they attacked and lost their discipline. So there is that question mark about whether he had true command over his cavalry. But ultimately, he did win. And it was his decision to attack. It was his decisions throughout the battle to get at the Scottish weaknesses. He recognised attacking the flanks first. He also made that big, bold decision at the right time to bring the longbowmen forward to defeat the schiltrons, which of course he did. And as we've said, this was a turning point, really, not just in the battle, but also became a key part of English strategy in warfare for the next 150 years or so. So there we have the Battle of Falkirk done for you, and the trick is obviously to see how it fits in with some of the changes that are going to happen in this period up to 1500, and also it contains some features of warfare in the Middle Ages that you'll see time and time again, and you'll probably see repeated at Agincourt later in the period. Just one final word, which is about the civilian experience at Falkirk, the civilian impact. It needs to be remembered that most of the soldiers, particularly the infantrymen who fought on both sides, were not professional permanent soldiers. They were civilians, farm workers, recruited from nearby counties and compelled to serve the armies. So, you know, there is a bad civilian experience at Falkirk because they are the soldiers that are involved in it and are suffering the consequences of injuries and being killed in the battle. As well as that, also, after the Battle of Falkirk, there followed a series of raids by the English army across the countryside of Scotland. Fields and crops, towns were burned, looted, destroyed. Huge devastation on local civilians through the violence, the loss of their homes, the loss of their livestock, crops and their livelihood too, which once again shows us, as in all warfare over time, that civilians often suffer more than those actual combatants too in battles.